Well, if you missed any of his remarks, there were some very powerful ones from Secretary of State John Kerry just moments ago describing the horror committed in Syria. Take a listen to this.
We saw rows of dead lined up in burial shrouds, the white linen unstained by a single drop of blood. Instead of being tucked safely in their beds at home, we saw rows of children lying side by side, sprawled on a hospital floor, all of them dead from Assad's gas and surrounded by parents and grandparents who had suffered the same fate.
Tom Bevan is the executive editor of Real Clear Politics. Ralph Peters is a Fox News strategic analyst and author of Hell or Richmond. Tom, let me start with you. Clearly, a powerful case was laid out that chemical weapons were used. Was there a clear case, however, that some military response by the United States should be used in response to it?
Well, that was the one thing that was missing. I mean, Secretary Kerry made the sort of best case he could make in broad terms, but you know, what the public and I think what Congress are looking for is more of a plan. Like, what does that mean? You know, what is this attack going to entail? And more to the point, what's the strategy beyond the initial strike, and what sort of consequences, intended or unintended, might we be looking at? And that was something that he left out, but I'm sure is going to have to be fleshed out in the days to come.
Yeah. You know, Ralph, let me go to you. Charles Krauthammer has said that, you know, the only purpose here for a military strike by President Obama is to assuage the guilty conscience or vindicate the vanity of this president. Is it a valid point that this president, in a way, got the United States boxed into a corner by arguably, foolishly drawing a red line?
Yes, it is all about Obama's image. But please let me comment on Kerry's speech.
Go ahead.
Melodrama is not a substitute for a strategy. There are two key points here. One, for all the, you know, the cue the violin sorrow, he did not explain why there is a real and present danger to the United States that merits the use of our military forces. He does not seem to grasp that the Assad regime is not targeting America with its chemical weapons, but if the Assad regime falls, and I have no sympathy for that regime, if the Assad regime falls and Al-Qaeda and other Islamists get their hands on those chemical weapons, then we face a danger. The other point I'd like to make is that the hypocrisy in Kerry's remarks was absolutely stunning and revolting. When he called Assad a thug and a murderer who killed thousands of his own people with poison gas, he described Saddam Hussein. Saddam Hussein killed over 1 million people. Where was Kerry? Where was Obama then? Is there a difference? Was Saddam Hussein a good dictator who used good poison gas? Yeah. That was all melodrama, appealing to the emotions. We need hard-headed, rational analysis and strategy.
Tom, the United States has not intervened during the course of a 3-year war in which 100,000 people have died in brutal attacks, many of them committed by Assad, and yet the president appears to be ready to intervene now when 1,400 people are killed in chemical attacks. Does that strike some people as incongruous?
Sure, Greg. And I mean, look, the president's in a very tough spot politically. I mean, he's sort of isolated on the international stage. Kerry went out of his way to mention the UN and how that's not an option. We saw the vote in Great Britain. Our longest ally is not going to be with us. We don't have support from the Arab League. We don't have support from NATO. So the president's sort of isolated internationally with the exception of France. Domestically, we saw a poll come out today. The majority of the public is against it. 80% of the public feels that the president needs to go to Congress, and we have over close to 200 members of Congress urging the president to consult with him, not just consult with them, but get their authorization. Kerry sort of indicated that they're going to consult with them, but he did not make any declaration that they were actually going to seek congressional authorization. And remember, Congress doesn't come back for another 10 days, and so the further we get away from the actual point of the attack, that imminency argument that Ralph mentioned loses a bit of its luster.
Former President Jimmy Carter is saying, you know, that a strike here would be illegal if initiated by President Obama and then Senator and candidate for President Obama in 2007. Can we put this up on the screen? He wrote this: "The president does not have the power under the Constitution to unilaterally authorize a military attack in a situation that does not involve stopping an actual or imminent threat to the nation." Though given what Secretary Kerry said a moment ago, it sounds as though the president is simply going to consult with Congress and not seek their authorization. I want to go to Judy Miller, who has been standing by in the newsroom. And Judy, you've been watching what's been going on. Your reaction to this?
Well, I think the enormous power of the Secretary's speech rests in the invocation of a doctrine that we haven't heard a lot about for a long time. It's called the responsibility to protect. The shorthand for it is R2P. And it basically says that human beings, countries, have an obligation to protect people who are being slaughtered in mass numbers. And in 2005, there was a summit, an international summit at which the world signed on to this doctrine. The problem for the Obama administration is that in order to invoke this doctrine, to make this action legal and politically acceptable, you have to have UN Security Council blessing for it, which he doesn't have. So instead, what the Secretary did was tie the use of chemical weapons directly to American interests by saying, if we do nothing here, Iran will not believe us, and they may very well move towards a nuclear weapon, and others may very well use the weapons against us one day. That's called a preventive use of force. It's not a legal argument. It doesn't make it legal, but it does make it a very powerful political and humanitarian statement of the reason for intervention.
And yet atrocities are committed in other places on different continents all the time, and we don't engage in the doctrine of responsibility to protect. I want to play a quick clip here of Secretary of State John Kerry. Take a listen to this.
With our own eyes, we have seen the thousands of reports from 11 separate sites in the Damascus suburbs. All of them show and report victims with breathing difficulties, people twitching with spasms, coughing, rapid heartbeats, foaming at the mouth, unconsciousness, and death.
And again, you know, Ralph, awful things, heinous, atrocious, cruel, despicable acts happen in other places around the world, and the United States does not intervene.
Yeah, look, I'm not heartless. I feel for the victims. But we've had a decade of do-gooder wars that didn't do much good. Now, I believe, because of Kerry's speech, that Obama will attack. He will attack ineffectually, and it will make things worse. And you're absolutely right. Your point's critical. Look, at the turn of the millennium, in the wars in eastern Congo, in Central East Africa, 3 to 4 million black people died. Nobody cared. They were black, and there were no luxury hotels for reporters in the eastern Congo. What about there are assaults on Muslims in Burma right now. There have been, again, look what the use of poison gas, much broader by Saddam Hussein. And we cannot do everything. I feel for the people, but my primary concern is the security, well-being, and prosperity of the United States. Yeah. And I do not see a threat to the United States that merits our unilateral use of military force.
Tom, the president has, and the White House and other agencies have essentially leaked the details of what we're about to do. You know, the source, the weapons, the duration, the purpose. And one can argue that the president here has drawn this out, and he has, some call it, dithered. Has that dithering, if we can call it that, allowed Assad to simply move his military assets or displace them in ways to avoid serious consequences?
Well, that's probably a question for Ralph as the military expert. I mean, there certainly have been reports to that effect, Greg. But let me go back to Congress real quick, because I think it's important. If Obama does decide that he's going to go to Congress, you know, it's a place. I was speaking to some staffers on the Hill just today about this, and over the last 5 years, President Obama, his relations with Congress haven't been great, and there isn't a reservoir of goodwill among Republicans, certainly, but even among his own party, even among Democrats. that he can really draw on in this moment of need, because it really, if he decides to go that route, it is a moment of need. And if he decides not to go to Congress, that is also very perilous politically. So he's in a very tough spot, and we'll see how it plays out over the next few days.
You know, Ralph, Secretary Kerry said, what's the risk of doing nothing? Well, that's certainly a risk, but one could say there's a greater risk of doing something. And that could be the retaliation by anyone from Syria directly onto Jordan or Western assets, or Hezbollah in southern Lebanon could attack various strategic locations.
Yeah, and that's crucial. I mean, in addition to weighing the risk of doing nothing, you have to weigh the risk of doing something and getting it wildly wrong. And per your earlier question, if you want to have an effective military attack, there are two things you want: surprise and sufficient force to make a decisive difference. Pinprick strikes are only going to encourage Assad, but also Iran, to believe we're timid, which is symbolic, we don't really mean it. On the other hand, what happens if there are devastating strikes? There aren't going to be, but war game it. Going to be devastating strikes against Assad. Then you have al-Qaeda in Damascus, and probably with chemical weapons. What's happened here is our president, as Charles Krauthammer observed, has backed himself into a corner, and he wants our military to get him out of it. They are not thinking through the potential consequences. Yeah. To me, the consequences of doing nothing for now are less threatening.
Although Krauthammer at the same time said, retribution is not a valid purpose, but a strategic purpose of removing the Assad regime might be. He argued at one point in time U.S. standoff systems could degrade the military. And in fact, the Wall Street Journal, Bret Stephens makes the argument, why not a military strike to take out Assad himself?
Yeah, well, may I answer
Sure.
for me? Well, because Assad is a monster and a thug and a murderer. Kerry's right. But he's charcoal gray and al-Qaeda's black. I mean, if the alternative is a rump state of Syria, a division of Syria, and Islamists in Damascus with chemical weapons, is that better for us? Is that better for Israel? Charles Krauthammer is America's most brilliant columnist, unquestionably. But he and I just disagree. He thinks better get rid of Assad. I think better to keep al-Qaeda on the ropes.
All right. Many thanks to Tom Bevan and Ralph Peters, as always. Thank you very much as well. Appreciate your insights. Jamie?
Just the beginning of our look at this developing story. We're back in just a moment with what is happening right now at the United Nations, what's happening in the Middle East, and what we can expect next from the White House. Stay with us.
We know where the rockets were launched from and at what time. We know where they landed and when. We know rockets came only from regime-controlled areas and went only to opposition-controlled or contested neighborhoods.